We are back, and we are joined now by Dr. Katie J. Wells, geographer at Georgetown University, co-author of Disrupting D.C, The Rise of Uber and the Fall of the City, which she co-wrote alongside do you mind saying the names of your co-authors?
Absolutely. Kafui Atto and Declan Cullen.
Wonderful, wonderful. Katie, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Great to be here, Emma.
So, Washington, D.C. was the first city that you write about to really formally resist Uber, and 2011 is the year when Uber first approached them, and that's a lot of what your work focuses on here. And you and your co-authored worked with drivers in D.C. in 2016, and that helped kind of shape the narrative here. But before we get to that, I'd love to start from the beginning. From a national perspective, how did Uber explode in the United States? What were the conditions that really led to the takeover of this tech company that, pretends it's a car service but doesn't want any of that oversight that goes with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's several important conditions to understand why is it that Uber has become the common sense solution that it is. And one of that has to do with car service, the state of car service regulation in the US, which was really heavily deregulated already by 2011. So the state of chauffeured services or taxis, they weren't great, right? And so you couple that with the Great Recession, which meant that there was a huge number of people struggling with underemployment. And you also have sort of a rush of money that needs to find a place to go from Silicon Valley. You take those conditions, you add in decaying mass transit, and a huge number of people with disposable incomes that had these new machines in their pockets called smartphones. And suddenly you have sort of recipe for the rise of Uber.
Yeah, you mentioned the Great Recession there. I mean, on its face, my initial reaction would be, well, with the recession and all of the layoffs and unemployment, this kind of gig work is a prime to borrow from Naomi Klein, it's a shock doctrine situation where there's a vulnerability that is exploited by this company where people are desperate and need to make money quickly. Is that a fair reading of how Uber began to get a foothold?
Absolutely, exactly. And we actually, sort of use the work of geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore to talk about Uber as a geographic solution to social and economic crisis, much the way Naomi Klein looks at these sort of shifts in capital and how they shape, the way we respond to them.
Right. It is. I hadn't really thought about it in that way before, but your book does a great job of laying that out, and also being critical of the neoliberal politics that even preceded that moment. Let's go back really to the 1980s and how some of those conditions that were created in cities set the table for this kind of work.
Yeah, that's great. So the reality is Uber didn't cause the problem, right? It just came in and benefited from it. And we want to be clear about that, right? In the 1980s, there was all kinds of federal defunding of cities, right? There was an abandonment of sorts. So you can look at all kinds of cities that didn't have great transit systems, that didn't have great options, especially when it came to racial inequality, didn't options in terms of how they responded to it. And so policymakers really, as well as cities from the 1980s, were really stymied. They had very limited toolboxes in which to address the crises they were facing.
Yeah, I mean, and can you expand on that a little bit? What the political situation was like that caused this disinvestment in cities?
Yeah, I mean, we can actually go back to the beginning, the founding of our country, right? It has been
Great.
Anti-urban. Let's do it, okay? In the founding, 1780s, right? The initial Congress and sort of the get-go of first imaginings of what American life would be like, it was heavily structured against cities, right? Funding for cities was limited. Many of them were underfunded, and many of them still are today. So over the years and decades, there have been periods where cities got funding, like the 1960s. But by the 1980s, that was waning, right? And so there was white flight. There was a huge, we can watch after, the civil rights movement, a huge defunding of things like public pools, golf courses, all kinds of amenities, but also basic ones like grocery stores in all areas of the city, or bus stops or transit.
Right. And is that, how explicitly racist was that effort of disinvestment? We're in this Reagan era too, right? Of capitalist worship, and so pairing that white flight, disinvestment in cities, I think it paints a clear picture of structural racism.
Absolutely. And I think we can look at the work of Kevin Cruz or others who have documented how places in Georgia, for instance, were explicitly racist in their decision to not fund particular urban infrastructure anymore. But I want to be careful to not mark it as something explicitly of Reagan, right? We also have Carter, who was starting to do these public-private partnerships. And so when we saw Uber come in 2011, 2012, we thought, on one hand, maybe this is just a new public-private partnership, but it felt like something different was afoot. And so that's why we think that it marks sort of an exacerbation of this trend.
Right.
It's sort of like,
right. I mean, and it does seem kind of like it's the apex of these dynamics that you speak about here. In your book, you talk about this term technological solutionism, and this being a hallmark or an example of that very dynamic, which is a neoliberal tendency, I would say. Can you expand on that definition for our audience, what that means in practice?
yeah, I mean, it's a very simple thing, and I think I've adhered to it much of my whole life, this idea of technological solutionism, right? It's wonderful to have a washing machine wash your clothes and eliminate the need to hire someone to do that or do that work yourself, right? Technology is supposed to help us live better lives. The reality is, and the danger is, when we allow it to sort of offer up really limited solutions, it inhibits our ability to come up with better options. And so there is a fantasy, certainly in the Obama years, that technology is going to, be our way forward to these really messy structural problems. But technology is still, at the end of the day, a machine, a tiny little limited machine that can only do what its, makers set it to do. So it's embedded with politics and power imbalances. And so technological solutionism is sort of pretending like those power imbalances don't exist.
It's not a coincidence then that so many Obama staffers seem to went and Jay Carney worked for Uber, right? Or did he work for Amazon? No, he worked for Amazon. I forget. Yeah. But there were
David
other.
Plouffe.
Sorry,
David Plouffe.
Yes, right, exactly. I mean, the connection between that era of Democratic Party insider / Obama administration official and the promulgation of Uber, I think that's incredibly notable.
Yeah, and I don't blame them, right? On some level, we found this with the 30 DC area policymakers we followed for 5 years, right? They had sort of the fantasy or the belief that maybe this could help, right? They were not sort of, they did not see the problems of urban life, that they fell for this crappy solution. I don't know, it's hard to blame them, right? But a decade out now, we're ready to blame them.
Right, exactly.